Welcome to everyone this morning to our second installment on electronic signatures. We are so glad you could join us and so happy. We have already just over almost 150 attendees in. I just want to give a few more seconds to allow for more to join us this morning, but it's certainly a privilege to have you on board with us this morning on this beautiful sunny Johannesburg Friday morning, ready to hit the road for the weekend. Just a few more seconds. Welcome, welcome, everybody. We're just giving a few more seconds for our attendees to have an opportunity to join, as we did have over 400 people registering. Just one more second, almost there. Welcome, welcome everyone to our second installment on electronic signatures. I'm going to start the proceedings now. We've given quite a few. We're sitting at 190, just still ticking, coming in. And while we're waiting for more, my name is Melanie Romaglio, and I'm the Sales Marketing Director for LexisNexis South Africa. And it is my honor to address you today. It's a great privilege for us as LexisNexis to host you on this beautiful morning. I will start with our house rules for today and a brief run through of the program. Welcome, welcome to those who are joining and coming in. Our webinar will run for approximately 1 hour today. We will have time to answer questions towards the latter part of the webinar. Please start thinking about your questions and make use of the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. All audience mics must please be muted just to ensure that everybody can hear clearly. Should you wish to engage with us during the session, please use our chat function to make your comments and we will respond. Please note that a recording of this webinar will be available to all attendees by the end of next week. This will be an interactive session this morning with a poll, which will be run during the session. We encourage the audience to participate in answering the poll questions. This will help us engage with the audience. So welcome, welcome to everybody who's still coming in this morning to LexisNexis' second installment on electronic signatures. And before I hand over to you, George, I just want to share some context around LexisNexis and electronic signatures. We started our journey with electronic signatures in 2011, and we've been instrumental in providing digital signature platforms such as LexisSign to financial institutions, government departments, attorneys, and listed companies. Our platform LexisSign is built to be fully compliant with the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. Despite the global need for the adoption of electronic signatures in the interest of business efficiencies and security, there is still often hesitance to adoption, and the most often asked questions are the following. How do I trust electronic signatures? Are these signatures valid? Another question, will these signatures stand up in court? And another one just for your thought, how do I present electronic signatures evidence in court. Today, my colleague, George Finley, will take you through these questions and many others in his discussions regarding the validity of electronic signatures and cybersecurity. George needs no introduction in this arena, but I will share some highlights on who he is. George Finley is a seasoned attorney who has experience as a notary and conveyancer. After practicing law for 10 years, George joined LexisNexis, where he has worked closely with conveyancing and banking software platforms, building an impressive client list along the way. Since 2011, George has been able to leverage his insights from his practicing days and has helped grow LexisSign to the customer base it is today, where he has become the thought leader regarding digital signatures. And I'm proud and humbled and privileged this morning to say thank you again for you joining us this morning. And I hand over to my esteemed colleague, George. Morning, George.
Morning, Mel. I have a friend who's a member of the Professional Editors Group. They call themselves POG, but they have a rather sad saying, and that is that most things written are never meant to be read. I find that rather sad. And with signing, it's kind of the same. Most things that are signed are never meant to be read, and most things that are signed are never meant to be tested. But the big question arises that if it needs to be tested, the question is your house in order? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is the validity of your signature, and more specifically, the validity of electronic signatures. Because if the day comes that they are tested, will they stand up in court? That's what we're going to be talking about today, because another saying which I quite like a lot, and that is, doing the right thing is always the right thing. So I'm going to show you how best to do the right thing with respect to your adoption of electronic signatures in the world that we're living in today. So welcome and thank you. Thank you, Mel. Right, so let's have a look at the agenda that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at why do we sign and the definition of signatures. We're going to be looking at a little bit of history around signatures, where they come from and why we actually sign these things, which we so regularly and ordinarily do. And then we're going to do a little comparison of wet signatures versus digital signatures, and the validity and the weight of the validity between the two of them. So the lawyers in the room, wet versus digital, I'm sad to tell you, is not an appellate division decision that you can rely on with respect to wet signatures versus digital signatures. But following that, we're going to look at the legislative environment and the landscape and the laws that are applicable, and how, if you're adopting digital signatures in the world that you live in, how you've got to approach the legislation. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at what happens if your documents are tested in court, not the document, but your signatures are tested in court. How is that interpreted with respect to the South African legislative landscape? So we're going to have a look at that. And then we're going to have a look at what I refer to as the pen providers. I'm going to touch on it just lightly, but a digital signature platform really is just a swanky pen. So we're going to look at the pen providers as such. And then there are some common questions that, since the previous webinar, that have come up, and we're going to look at some of those common questions. And of course, you're free to raise any questions during the session today as well. So then we will end with open questions for the group today. But anyway, let's kick off with our agenda. But before I carry on about the specific items on the agenda, I'm first going to talk to you a little bit with this black screen. So here's this black screen, so you don't have to read anything. I'm just going to talk a little bit about history and the digitization of our modern world. We're all very aware that digitization has changed and disrupted us in many ways. And whenever there is a form of digitization, there are always early adopters, and then there are long-term resistors. But usually over time, society adapts and people adapt, and a new technology platform usually finds its place and gets entrenched in the world that we live in. And there are some salient examples that we all know about and have all embraced over time. I mean, the classic one, of course, is letters, handwritten letters to email. I mean, what an absolute game changer that is, that has been globally. And well, has it all been good? I'm not so sure. I think there is an enormous amount of poor writing that takes place and bad language and an enormous amount of unnecessary writing. I mean, we all have inboxes that are completely flooded most of the time. Be that as it may, it might have, but I'm not so sure, saved a couple of trees in the process. But what it has certainly done is it has created a global village. It has made communication simple, cheap, easy, and efficient. And it's on the back of the letters to email change that many a digital signature platform is also built. Other changes that we've all experienced are things like cash to card. I mean, we're all familiar with how that has changed. I mean, even my 90-year-old mother has adapted electronic banking and has moved from almost into a kind of cashless society. The same can be said for telecommunication. I mean, landlines to cell phones. All of you in the room, I bet you within arm's length from where you're sitting now, have your mobile phone. I mean, what an enormous change that has been. And we've got voice over internet protocols, the kind of communication that we're doing now. I mean, that has been an enormous change. And another one that, of course, has happened in the past 6 to 8 months is the almost disappearance of the boardroom and the conference venue into this venue. I mean, hasn't this change been embraced, and isn't it remarkable? The only thing that's, I think, bad about this communication at the moment is we aren't enjoying pastries at 11 o'clock and maybe having a nice choice of lunch at lunchtime. That's all missing. You have to go to your own kitchen and make a slice of toast. But anyway, let's bring it down to what we're talking about, which is wet ink signatures into digital. There are already early adopters. There are a lot of us that believe we're doing it and believe we're doing it right. And there, of course, are resistors too. And then there is always the question is whether they're valid. And it reminds me of a seminar I attended many years ago regarding the registration and formation of family trusts. And when I walked into the seminar, the presenter, the first thing he said, I am sure you are all attending this seminar today because you're worried about the trusts you've already registered and whether they are valid. And I want to put that out to you today is possibly you're here today because you're worried about all the documents you've already signed in all sorts of manners which you believe might be a digital signature or a valid digital signature. And that's what we need to discuss today in a lot of detail. So, how many of you have embraced digital signatures and embraced electronic signing in different shapes and sizes and different formats? Well, the thing that always fascinates me is all of us in the room have used a digital signature of sorts today already many times over. I mean, I ask myself, where have you signed in? Note the word signed. Where have you signed in today? Well, the moment you woke up, you probably picked up your mobile phone. And what did you do? You signed into your mobile phone. How did you sign into your phone? Well, you had to identify yourself. One of the key elements is identification. How did you identify yourself on your phone? Well, you probably had a little squiggle that you made with your finger, or maybe a biometric print with your thumb, or a secret PIN that only you knew how to get into your phone. So there's the first bit of electronic signing, as it were, that you did this morning at 6 a.m. Within seconds, you probably signed into Facebook and did exactly the same thing. Later in the morning, you signed into your computer. You pressed Control, Alt, Delete, and what else? A unique identifier which identified you. You signed into your computer. Next thing is you signed into Zoom, and in order to attend this webinar. So what I'm showing to you today is that we've all use digital signatures, a form of identification, many times over without even realizing it. So what I'm showing you is all of you are not just early adopters, but you've embraced it already and it's second nature. But today we're going to be talking about documents, all kinds of documents and the signing of documents and how we make sure that they are valid. That's right. So let's go back in time. Why do we sign things? This is the part that I quite like because it's got a nice little bit of history. We've got Roman seals. You know the story about the Roman emperor with his seal ring that he has on his pinky, which he affixes onto the piece of paper after having dipped it into the molten wax. So that was the first form of signing. What did he do? He identified himself. Similarly, quills and ink. We have pen and paper that we're so familiar with. And of course, the digital signing that I mentioned now with respect to you signing into your phone and signing into Facebook. So all of that. But why do we sign these things? Why did the Roman emperor sign these things? And why, with the quill and the papyrus, etc., why did all of that happen? Well, it's in order to create three things: certainty, confidence, and truth. But let's look at the word validity, because that's what we're talking about today. The validity of the digital signatures is our primary focus. So let's look at the definition of validity. Validity is the state of being officially or legally binding or acceptable. That's what we want. When we're using our digital signature platform, or when we're using a pen or making a cross on a piece of paper, we want to make sure that the state of being, that signature, is officially or legally binding or acceptable. But let's just step back a little bit, and we're going to look a bit at the fundamentals of signatures. So there are four pillars of certainty with respect to signatures. Now you can put them in any category, whether you're imagining your handwritten signature or whether you're doing a digital signature. There are four key fundamentals, and no matter how you do it, whether you're making a cross on a piece of paper with a big pen, or whether you're signing into your phone, or whether you're doing a digital signature on a digital signature platform, the four fundamentals remain exactly the same. The first one is identity. In the case of the second one, at least, is non-repudiation. The third one is proof. And the fourth one is confidence. I'm going to have a look at each of these four things separately. So let's look at identity. In the case of wet ink signatures, how do you maintain, or how at least do you determine this identity? Well, someone might come into your office. You will see them in front of you. They might show you an identity document, and they will sign the document. And that is how the identity is confirmed in the world of wet ink signatures. How certain is that? Well, sometimes in order to underpin that certainty, you may call in a witness into the signing ceremony, and that witness is the person who also confirms or might be able to confirm the identity of that primary signer. But however, in the case of digital signatures platforms, you have far deeper levels of confirming the identity of the individual. So you've got handwritten authentication. Now, what is handwritten authentication in the form of a digital signature? Well, I'm going to show you this. I don't know if you can see that, but this is what the brand is Wacom, but it's a digital signature pad that looks like that, which you sign with a little stylus on top of that. Now, the key thing about this digital signature pad is it has all sorts of things built into it. It's called the orthography. So it's the orthography of the signature. If I sign on this digital signature pad, it measures how hard I dot my I's or how fast I cross my T's. So that is the kind of handwritten authentication which forms part of the identification of the signer. But there is even another level of this, and that is electronic authentication. So each of you this morning in my example with electronic authentication used a PIN or use a code or a one-time PIN or your email address in order to log into your Facebook account or your phone account or into your computer. So that would be the electronic authentication. So here with the digital signature platforms, we've got further levels of determining the identity of the individual, far more than the wet ink signatures. And it doesn't stop there. The third one would be biometric authentication. So we're all familiar with that idea. So some of you logged into your phones this morning using a thumbprint, for instance. There's a lot of iris identification that's in the process, that kind of thing. That's the biometric authentication we speak of. And then another form of identification is cryptographic authentication. So this is where you're dealing with digital certificates. Those attorneys in the room today, for instance, who do electronic guarantees, that is all by way of digital certificates. That is public and private key encryption, which is known as cryptographic authentication. So what I'm showing you here with respect to the first pillar of the signature fundamentals, and which is identity, that with wet ink signatures, you have identity determined by maybe some kind of documentary proof, or maybe some kind of visual, or maybe a witness. However, and that of course is if you're using a proper digital signature platform, with a digital signature, you've got far deeper levels of determining the identity of the signee. Let's look at the next pillar, which is non-repudiation. Another word for non-repudiation, tampering. We don't want people fiddling with the document. How do you make sure, and how can you be certain that things cannot be undone? So for the lawyers in the room, you all know that there's a plethora of case law with respect to documentation and forgeries and whether documents have been edited or not edited. And in the case of wet ink, we all know that that burden of proof is seriously tiresome. How do you prove that something has or has not been edited or forged or altered? So you sit with handwriting experts, costly court days, that kind of thing, in order to determine the non-repudiation of documents. However, if you use a proper digital signature platform, and this is a line that I'm going to repeat quite a bit, and that is the use of a proper digital signature platform, then you can be ensured that there is no tampering. Because what the digital signature platform does is that once this document has been signed by the signees, then the digital signature platform locks down the document and makes it uneditable. And that is what you want, because what you want is in 10 years' time, when you're appearing in front of the judge, you want to be absolutely sure that this document has not been tampered with. And that is one of the key fundamentals, is the non-tampering feature that you have in a proper digital signature platform. So that is a super important fundamental for me as well. The third one is proof. So I used the word earlier about the signing ceremony. I quite like the word signing ceremony. And while preparing for this talk, I was picturing, what does a signing ceremony look like? So I can imagine Julius Caesar with the molten wax and his ring, affixing that seal onto the document. But then the next modern day signing ceremony I had in my head was, you can picture Donald Trump sitting behind his desk at the Oval Office, and he's about to sign something into law, whatever it might be. And there would be, I don't know, 15, 20 people in black suits standing around him. And then very ceremoniously, he would affix his signature onto the document. So that's the kind of signing ceremony I initially picture. But what is the signing ceremony with respect to a, again, proper digital signature platform? And this is the thing that I quite like, and that is, there is a recordal of absolutely everything that happens. There's a recordal of how the signing session was created, how the signatory was identified, how the signatory received the document, how the signatory signed the document, how the signatory returned the document, and how the document was locked down by way of a digital certificate in that non-repudiation clause. So that is the thing, what I call the audit trail. So the audit trail is the digital way of showing the Donald Trump with all the people standing behind him, but it's the audit trail giving the proof and the certainty that things happened in a certain way. And if you use a proper digital signing platform, you will have that audit trail, which will assist you and stand by you in the case of your signature being tested one day, which hopefully doesn't happen. So remember that, of course, sorry, and then a collection of the above three, of course, brings you the confidence, and which is the certainty that others will do what they promise to do, which will be contained in your document. Right, so let's have a look at wet ink signatures, because remember, in my wet versus digital, that is on my agenda, I said we're going to have a look at wet ink signatures versus digital signatures, because it's a little bit to me like layers. What I want to show you is that wet ink signatures have certain layers, and digital signatures have also certain layers, but they're far better layers. It's a little bit like a chocolate cake. You can have a chocolate cake which has a single layer, and it's fine and it does its work, but you can have a multi-layer chocolate cake which is just better than a single layer chocolate cake. So remember, a wet ink signature and a digital signature does the same thing. The only difference is that the digital signature does it so much better. Let's do a little comparison. So remember, we're talking about validity, hey? So the state of being legally, officially binding, or acceptable. How does that happen with wet ink signatures? Well, the first step, now we have discussed this already, but let's just look at it properly. So you sign on paper with wet ink. So again, for the lawyers in the room, you remember the old thing of the illiterate man symbolically holding the hand of the magistrate while the magistrate makes the cross on the piece of paper. This is regarded as proper signing. So that is how you sign on a piece of paper, and we're all familiar with that, whether you're making your mark. And of course, as I said, the identity of the signee, the weight behind that is rather thin. It might be in the presence of, but if you're sending the document off to somewhere else, to someone to sign somewhere else, there's no way that you can properly identify them. So for that reason, the authentication of the signer is enhanced by a witness or a co-signer of some document. And that is really problematic. I spoke about the non-repudiation. So that means, can you prove that the document has or has not been tampered with? That is very, very difficult. And if you end up having to prove that, you have complex forensic handwriting experts in litigation, etc. And it is costly and expensive and difficult to prove. And of course, there's a plethora of case law, as I said, with respect to that. Wet ink signatures have served us well. Make no mistake, they've been working not perfectly, not by any means, but they've served us well, and they serve their purpose. Digital signatures, as I say, serve the same purpose, but only better. Remember again, we're talking about validity, which is the state of being legally, officially binding, or acceptable. So there are many digital signature platforms out there. Some are cheap, some are pricey, some are glitzy, some are fast, some are very smart websites, all that kind of thing. All of that stuff is very glitzy and fine. But the important thing are these layers of the chocolate cake. Showed you the layers of the wet ink signatures, but make sure that the digital signature platform that you use has the correct layering. Because if you're looking at the signing process, the first one is the electronic signature itself. So how do you do that? Well, I gave the illustration of the Wacom pad or the digital signature pad, which automatically records, but there are other forms of signature, whether it could be a one-time PIN or a password of sorts. Those could all be interpreted as electronic signatures as well. But the other important thing is, how do you identify the signee? So this is the next layer. Remember, I said in the wet ink signature scenario, you might have a co-witness or documentary proof in the form of an ID book or the like. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's absolutely crucial, is you have authentication by way of electronic authentication, biometric authentication, or cryptographic authentication. And the beautiful part about these forms of authentication is they don't die, and they don't go on holiday, or they aren't difficult to trace or track down the day when you're sitting in the High Court litigating about the validity of a signature. I mean, you can imagine in a wet ink scenario, you looking at a document in 10 years' time, no one can identify the witness anymore. There is purely a squiggle, as opposed to the digital authentication. As I said, that it doesn't go away. It's there forever. There is a track record of exactly how everything happened. That brings us to the non-repudiation again. Remember, I gave the signing ceremony scenario. The documents are non-editable, and there is proof thereof that they are non-editable. And that is the audit trail, and at least of the signing ceremony. So that is absolutely crucial the day when you appear in court, that you have this audit trail with you. So make sure that your digital signing platform provides you with these audit trails of the signing ceremony. So that brings me, of course, yeah, sorry, my last point was you won't end up having spurious litigation, because the chances of your signing session and the authentication of your signature being tested is far slimmer than in the case of wet ink signatures. And that brings me to that point that I used about the pen providers. So a digital signature does the same work, as I said, as a wet ink signature. It's just provided by a very fancy pen. So the fancy pen is that digital signature platform. And my key message today to all of you is, make sure that that fancy pen that you use, this digital signature platform that you use, is a proper digital signature platform. So make sure you use the correct pen. And why do I say you must use the correct pen? Well, it's because the law says so. The South African law says so, and which laws say so? So there are three sources of law, and that is the common law, the ECT Act, and the legislation which is applicable to your specific transaction. Now that third line, which is legislation applicable to a specific transaction, it is not anything unique. Remember, there is legislation specific about how you must sign a will. There's legislation specific about how you must sign a deed of sale for fixed property and the like. The important part is the middle part, and that is the ECT Act, which is the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. It's actually quite an oldish piece of legislation, but in that piece of legislation, it defines the requirements for electronic signatures in Section 1. It talks about the two types of data message. So it's the data which is affixed to the signature and the data which is affixed to the document, and how that must be interpreted. So again, my message is, make sure you use a proper signature platform. Your pen, your digital pen, has to be correct in that it must comply with the ECT Act. The second thing that the ECT Act is very specific about is the requirements for identifying the person, plus that method must be reliable and appropriate. So I've spoken there about biometric authentication, electronic authentication, cryptographic authentication, all of those things, and those are the requirements for identifying the individual. So if you want your digital signature to stand up in court one day, be absolutely sure that you meet these requirements of identification, or shall I say that your platform meets these requirements of identification. So here's the scenario. I mean, you can imagine now during COVID time, all the bankers in the room, there are lots of you in the room, I saw, that maybe distributed documents for signature to your clients who you could not see in person. What did they do? They did a sign, scan, sign, copy, or at least print, sign, scan, email, or they did a cut and paste job of a signature onto a document. So what kind of signature is that? And will that stand up in 10 years' time or 5 years' time when that person defaults on his loan? The proof of the pudding, as I said in my introduction, will only be tested when things go wrong. When things are going fine, it's absolutely not a problem. But it's important to make sure that you have all those layers that I mentioned. All those layers in your digital signature process must be there in order for it to stand up in court. So why is that? Well, Section 15.3 of the ECT Act talks about assessing the evidential weight of a data message. So that is how the weight of your document and your signature, the evidential weight, how will it be interpreted when you reach court that day? Well, the important thing is, of course, one, is the reliability of the manner in which the data message was generated, stored, or communicated. So in my scenario, you sent a document off to your client somewhere in the sticks. He did a print, sign, scan, email, cut and paste job on the document, sent it back to you, you granted him the loan, whatever the case might be. 5 years' time, when the default happens, the court will look at the reliability of the manner in which the data message was generated, stored, and communicated. Absolutely crucial. Section 15.3 is how the court will measure the evidential weight of your digital signature. 2 is the reliability of the manner in which the integrity of the data message was maintained. So where was it kept all this time? Use a proper digital signature platform. There's a proper record, a proper audit trail, a proper matter history with respect to every single signing session and every single distributed signing session will be there. And thirdly is the manner in which the originator was identified. So have a look at this, because this is supremely important. You must ask yourself, who is the provider and do they comply with this section? If you are called to court in 10 years' time, will your provider be able to stand there and help you to show you that they have a reliable manner in which the data message was generated, stored, communicated, etc. So that's super important. The question that more often than not comes up, of course, and that is, how do you exhibit this? How do I show this to court? I mean, physically speaking, how do you do the discovery of this in court? Well, the nice part about it is Section 15.4. I know it's a long paragraph, you don't have to read it, but the key thing is the line that says, certified to be correct by an officer in the service of such a person is on its mere production in a civil, administrative, disciplinary proceedings admissible in evidence. So that's absolutely crucial, that if you, at least you can just sign a printed copy of your digital document certified by the officer from that particular office, and that will be accepted in court. So that is how you present your evidence in court. So I'm heading towards conclusion time. I'm checking the time now, and that brings me to the validity in court questions. So the one thing, as I said to you right in the beginning as well, is the purpose, the digital signing and wet ink signatures do the same thing. The only thing is digital is better than ink. Digital is faster than ink. Digital is far more reliable than ink. Digital is supported by the ECT Act, but there always is a big but. And the but that I want to give the message across today is make absolutely sure that you use a proper platform like LexisSign. One of the other topics in the heading is the question of cybersecurity. Sorry, I just want to close that there. Is the question of cybersecurity. Hold a second. Some of you may remember a film called Catch Me If You Can. It starred Leonardo DiCaprio. It actually wasn't too bad a movie. And Leonardo DiCaprio played a guy called Frank Abagnale. And he was a forger, and he was an impersonator. And he did it very effectively. He forged checks and he forged security documents, and he impersonated even an airline pilot and a doctor or something at the time. Anyway, Frank Abagnale in the real world was convicted, and he served his time, and he's since been released, and he now works, I don't know if it's for the CIA or the FBI, but one of those. And there's a lovely YouTube TED talk given by Frank Abagnale, the very guy that Leonardo DiCaprio portrayed. And someone in the audience asks him the question, and he asks, is it easier or harder in today's world to commit these fraudulent acts, the type that you did? Is it easier or harder today than it was back then? I think it was in the 1970s or 80s or so. His very quick reply was, it's way, way easier. And everyone was kind of flabbergasted. And then he just gave us a very simple example, which I want to share with you today. And that is, all of you, wherever you may be sitting now, in front of your computer, have access to world-class document generation software. You can cut and paste absolutely anything. If I want to create a document pretending that it is a letter from, call it the CEO of Coca-Cola, I can go onto the Coca-Cola website, I can get their last year's financial statements signed off by their CEO and their CFO. I do a cut and paste of their signature, affix it to a document with perfect logos at the top. That's the kind of thing that he was illustrating. And the only way to combat that is to make sure you use the proper platforms when we get to digital signatures. Because remember, there are the 4 kinds of certainty: identity, non-repudiation, proof, and confidence. You've got to make sure that that your platform underpins those 4 kinds of certainty. Because, you know, despite all of this, people will and can always commit fraud. People can and will always go back on their word. And people can and will try and fail to carry out our wishes or their promises. And sadly, that's the problem with the human element. We can reduce that as much as possible by using a proper digital signature platform. And that is the end of my talk for today. If you want to try out electronic signatures, you can give me a call. There are my details there. And for more information, you can get a free trial access, 60-day free trial, because LexisSign is built on the foundations of the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. LexisSign underpins the absolute fundamentals that I illustrated to you today in order to make sure that one day, if unfortunately that document needs to be read and that signature needs to be tested, that you have the support behind you with respect to your electronic signature. Questions? Mel, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, George, for all that insight. I've personally been signing my documents using electronic signatures, and it's been the most efficient way to do this as we all continue to work remotely. We already have a couple of questions that have been submitted, and I will start with these this morning. Is it possible to e-sign a court affidavit? Most or all affidavits are required to be commissioned, and commissioning also occur electronically. And if so, how will this occur, George?
Mel, yeah, so that's a good question. In my talk today, I didn't talk about advanced electronic signatures at all. That is it's a South African construct, and it's a unique type of signature, but it is contained in the ECT Act. And the Act is very specific about how and when you must use an advanced electronic signature. So if you want to sign an affidavit, one of the other things I mentioned there was the laws that are applicable. Remember, I said there was the ECT Act, and then there was the laws applicable to your particular transaction. So with respect to affidavits, there's that piece of legislation called the Justices of the Peace Act, Justices and Commissioner of Oaths Act. And that act, read together with the ECT Act, would say to you that, yes, you must use an advanced electronic signature should you want to sign an affidavit. So as we sit here, it's not been done yet, but we are in the process of rolling it out, and we're going to be doing a pilot very soon. There is an appetite on the court side that they want to look at electronic affidavits, and the appearing in the presence of is really always the question. So am I appearing in the presence of all of you, and can I depose to an affidavit if one of you is a commissioner of oaths? So it's a debatable question, but all I can say, Mel, is watch the space. I think it is imminent that we're going to have commissioner of oaths signing by way of advanced electronic signatures. And the thing, of course, as we all know, is we need it tested in court so that we can set the precedent. But I think it's imminent.
Thank you, George. The other question was that I believe there are only 2 accreditation authorities for advanced electronic signatures, Law Trust and the Post Office. Why is this so? I.e., can LexisNexis not be an accreditation authority?
Yeah, okay. So the Act provides for the South African Accreditation Authority. So there are, and you're right, if you go onto their website, there are only the 2. This one is SAPO, or the South African Post Office, and the other one is Law Trust. So as we speak, they are the only 2 officially accredited entities that can issue advanced electronic signatures. I'm not saying the door is open for everyone, but the requirements are extremely stringent, and it's a matter of choice. So yes, LexisNexis could in theory apply to become one of the other accredited authorities, but that is a matter of choice, and I think that is a space we've decided not to go into as yet, but you never know.
Absolutely. One more question we got was, is it possible for e-signatures to be forged, copied and pasted, etc.? Would it not be better to use a thumbprint verification in addition to an e-signature to enhance authenticity of documents, George?
Yeah, so here's my story of old Frank Abagnale, you know, the catch me if you can guy. There will always be someone who's going to do it. There will always be someone who's going to fiddle the books. The important thing is, remember, in one of the 4 pillars, the one that said identity. So how do you identify someone properly? And that's what and the emphasis is on a proper digital signature platform, is you have to identify the person properly, and biometric identification is one of the ways with which you can identify someone. So to answer that question, just by way of a practical example, on the LexisSign platform, for instance, if I send a document off to someone in a different town to sign, the system would ask them to identify themselves. That's why I used the example of your phone this morning. You know, your phone asks you to identify yourself in a certain way. And so too, a proper digital signature platform will ask you to identify yourself by one or several ways, kinds of ways. So those are what we call multi-factor authentication. So you can say, well, George, 1, you've got to give me your ID number. Oh, okay, that's fine. 2, George, you've got to give a one-time PIN, which we're going to send to your phone, which I've got to put in. Or 3, George, even better, you've got to put your thumbprint onto a little device. Now, most of us don't have a device, but I think it's just a matter of time that your mobile phone would probably be a biometric identification device, which it kind of is already in any event. So I hope that answers your question, Mel, but yeah, absolutely.
Indeed, it has. Thank you, George. And now just moving towards the questions that's been posed on the Q&A section. One in particular, George, is can digital signatures be used for a last will and testament?
Nice question. I wish they could. Sorry, it's just a screen opening up. I certainly wish they could. Because if you think of the litigation that is taking place with respect to wills, they usually have to do with forgery, because someone says you forged Granny's signature and you forged the will and put my name there as the sole beneficiary instead of someone else's name. So if only they were, if there is one place which I think a digital signature would be absolutely perfect, is in the space of a will. But to answer your question, no, you can't, because the Wills Act specifically says how a will must be signed in the presence of two witnesses on the one hand, so that's the legislation applicable to wills, and the other one is the ECT Act specifically also excludes wills. So sadly, you can't sign a will with the digital signature. If you do, it's going to be invalid. It's got a major problem. So my opinion, wills would be perfect for digital signatures, but currently you can't. And the same, sorry, Mel, the same applies to agreements of sale with respect to fixed property. Remember, I don't know if I know there's some people from the Estate Agency Affairs Board and so on in the room. Remember, you may not sign a deed of sale with the digital signature. It's prevented by the Alienation of Land Act read together with the ECT Act. So, yeah. Mel.
Well, thank you, George. As the Sales and Marketing Director of LexisNexis, we stand for advancing the rule of law globally and nationally. So I think you and I will take that together as colleagues and see how we can advance the rule of law in that particular environment and influence policy and regulation with governments and get some evidence and research on the go for that. So that's what we can promise that our listeners can join in and help us with that project. Certainly it's something good to drive. Thank you, George. Another question, George, I find is, which is quite interesting, is one of our attendees are saying, what happens when the proper digital signature platform has gone out of business by the time that the signature's validity needs to be authenticated?
Yeah, so if you look at a digitally signed document, let's say done on the LexisSign platform, we subscribe to what's referred to as LTV, which is long-term verification. And the long-term verification is an international standard, which means that you'll still be able to access the document, and the document speaks for itself. The document has embedded in it the metadata, which shows how the document was bedded down by way of the digital certificate, and the way that the signees were authenticated remains embedded in the document itself. So if LexisSign as a platform ceases to exist, and in 10 years' time, you might have a problem accessing the audit trail of the signing ceremony should things have been destroyed in the process. Pray not. But I think your evidentiary burden would in any event be far, far lighter than it would be than in the case of a wet ink signature.
Okay, thank you. Great answer. Thank you, George. We have one more. I think we've got a few minutes for, so 2 minutes more for one more question. I've got, is there an accreditation certificate or process which digital signature service providers are able to access or implement as evidence that the tool complies with legislation?
There is not a specific certificate. There is not something, there's no specific authority that will say that, let's say in the case of LexisSign, that LexisSign is an ECT approved platform. There is no such thing. The only thing that must happen is when you make use of a platform, ask the right questions. And that's what this seminar is about, is ask the right questions. We have substantial legal opinions that endorse and embrace and confirm that LexisSign is ECT compliant, and we certainly lean on that substantially. But to answer the question directly, Mel, there is not a specific certificate from an authority saying that LexisSign or any other provider for that matter is an authorized by some other body provider. The only authorization platform, as it were, is the South African Accreditation Authority, which has authorized the South African Post Office and Law Trust to be the issuers of those digital certificates and advanced electronic signatures.
Thank you, George.
Okay.
We have another one. Can a counterparty located in another jurisdiction, for example, the UK, utilize LexisSign on a document governed by South African law?
Yes, so you've got to remember that the signee doesn't need the platform. So argument's sake, I'm in South Africa and I distribute a document to the UK for someone to sign there. It is no different to me sending a paper document and they're signing it there with wet ink. The question is, and I often say that, is you've got the document speaks for itself. So if you're talking about jurisdictional issues, what does the document say about jurisdiction? That you've got to look at. So the answer to your question is yes, you can distribute the documents all over the world and you can sign all over the world. Mel.
Great, thank you. Is an Adobe signature signed and certified valid in South Africa law?
Well, I'm not going to be the one who's going to answer that. So in the case of you take that to trial and have a look and ask yourself, if you're doing an Adobe signing session, argument's sake, ask yourself the questions that I raised today. Those 4 fundamental pillars, does it comply with that? Ask yourself that if in 10 years' time, the document that you've signed with this Adobe, whether it's a cut and paste or there's a squiggle that appears like your signature, ask yourself that if you had to interpret section 13 of the ECT Act, and if you had to look at section 15, which talks to the evidential weight, which is, will it stand up in court? Ask yourself that question. As we speak, I mean, I speak under correction, but it's untested, and may it stay that way. But the important part, and that comes back to what Mel was saying about the LexisNexis mantra of advancing the rule of law. My way of saying that is doing the right thing is always the right thing. And if you're using a digital signature platform, make sure it is compliant by measuring it against those provisions of the ECT Act.
Okay, good, thank you. I think I've got one more question before we have to close off. Can a single document be signed by someone who has LexisSign and another person who doesn't, or who uses a different program?
Yes, that's the beauty of it. Just to explain quickly how it basically works. So let's say I am what I call the admin user. So I am the creator of a signing of a document or a signing session. So I may be the banker, or I might be the person working in the office at the airline, and I want to send out documents to people to sign. So I'm the officer at the airline, and I want to send a document to all the potential passengers of a certain flight, a document that they must all sign. Or the other example I often use is I'm the secretary at the school, and I want to send a document to all the parents of the school that they must give a consent that their child may go to the museum outing. That classic indemnity form. How do I get that indemnity form out to all the parents? So I'm the secretary at the school. I have LexisSign. I'm a licensed user of LexisSign. I create the document, I create the signing session, and I distribute it with a click of a button to all the staff, not the staff, all the parents at the school. They don't have LexisSign. All they need is a couple of things. They need a device. The device could be in the form of a laptop, like you're all sitting in front of, or your phone or your tablet. which we all have. So you need a device of sorts, you need an email address, and you need, of course, identity. You need identity. So that's the answer to the question, is absolutely yes. I can create a signing session and I can distribute it to everyone as long as I know who and where they are. So in my little scenario of the school secretary being able to distribute a document to all the parents of the grade 5 class to give consent or to give the indemnity for their kids to go to the museum, just shows that those parents don't need LexisSign. Only the creator of the signing session needs LexisSign. Now,
thank you, George. Thank you, George, and thank you for the insight and the answers. And thank you to all our attendees today as we close the session so that you can move on to your 11 o'clock call. Please don't forget, we also have an extended 60-day free trial, as George has said, and now available. So please give us a visit on lexissign.co.za. And if you have any further questions, please go to webinars@lexisnexis.co.za about the event. And please, we will have answers to the unanswered questions I could not cater for now, and we will distribute that to everybody on the emailer. Thank you once again. Have a fantastic weekend. Thank you, George. It was very insightful. Thank you for answering all the tough questions, and thank you to our attendees. We appreciate you. Have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mel. Bye.